FTP, or File Transfer Protocol, has been around since the 1970s. Since this time, it has been improved upon, adding features like encryption and support for firewalls. In this time, the basic functionality of FTP has not changed. FTP is still used today to transfer files from one computer to another. At the time this course was created, Windows Server 2008 came bundled with FTP version 6. After the release of Windows Server 2008, Microsoft released FTP version 7, available for download from the Microsoft website. FTP 7 has more features than FTP 6, and is likely to be tested more and more on the exam as time goes on. Once you understand FTP version 6 and FTP version 7, you will see that they share a lot of features, and one of the biggest changes between the two is the simple and easy to use interface found in FTP version 7. First I will go through FTP version 7, and then finish by going through FTP version 6. Once you download and install FTP 7 from Microsoft, you will be able to configure it through the ISS 7 admin tool. FTP 7 has the following improvements over FTP version 6. First, it has support for SSL encryption, so you can transfer your files securely. Next, it has simplified configuration and a simpler interface. Lastly, FTP 7 has binding support. This means you can bind multiple protocols and ports to the same FTP site. Binding makes configuration of FTP sites a lot simpler. Let's have a look how to install FTP 7. To install FTP version 7, you first need to install ISS 7 via the Server Manager. Select Roles and then select the option Add Roles. From the list, I want to select Web Server ISS and also select any other prerequisites that Windows asks for. The only component required is ISS Management Console. You can select other components if you wish, but make sure that you do not add the FTP server listed here. If you select any of the FT components from the list, you will be installing FTP version 6. This may cause conflicts with version 7. I would highly recommend uninstalling version 6 on your server before you install version 7. Once ISS has finished installing, run the FTP 7 setup program. The install is quite simple, but will not work if you don't have the ISS 7 Management Console installed. Once installed, run ISS Manager from Administrative Tools. To start using FTP 7, first you need to create a new FTP site. Expand onto Sites, right-click Sites and select Add FTP Site to start the Add FTP Site wizard. Next, enter an FTP name. The site name is purely for administrative reasons, so the end user will not see this. Enter a path for the FTP site. This will become the root folder of your FTP site. Next, assign an IP address to your FTP site. Otherwise, the FTP site will use all available IP addresses on that server. If your server is on multiple networks, you should choose only the IP addresses that you need, otherwise you could have a security problem. The virtual host settings define which domain name your FTP site is bound to. It is possible to have multiple FTP sites on the same IP address and same port. When the user logs in, they can add the virtual host name to their username, and Windows Server 2008 will direct them to the correct FTP site. This does make your setup more complicated, so I would suggest using a different IP address for each of your FTP sites if possible. By default, the FTP site will start automatically when Windows starts, but if you do not want this to happen, you can clear the Start FTP Site Automatically checkbox. If you have certificates set up on your network, you can set the SSL options to use certificates and select which certificates to use. On the next screen, you can configure authentication and authorization. If you enable anonymous access, then a user can access your website using the anonymous login and does not require username and password on your network. If you need to enable this kind of access, remember that anonymous access is disabled by default in ISS 7, so before any user can access it, you will need to enable it in ISS as well. Ticking basic authentication means that a connected user can send their username and password in clear text. If you have clients that do not support integrated Windows authentication, you may need to tick this option. Don't forget that this option does reduce the security of your network. The authorization section determines what a connected user can access. Only users selected here will be able to access files on the FTP server. If you have a group with usernames of people who are authorized to access the FTP server, you can select it here. Lastly, you can indicate the rights the user has, either read or write, to the FTP server. Remember, whatever authorization settings you set on this screen takes precedence to the Windows permissions. If you only grant read access here, the user will only have read access when they access the FTP site. even if they have full permissions to the file in Windows. Once you have FTP7 installed, you should configure some messages on it to customize your site. There are 4 different messages you can configure on your FTP server. Firstly, you can configure a banner. This will be displayed when the user first connects to your FTP server. It is important on the banner message to state authorized access only or restricted access to make it easier to prosecute a would-be hacker. When the user is authenticated and logged in, a welcome message will be displayed. When they log out, an exit message will be displayed. The max connection messages will be displayed only when a user attempts to connect to the FTP server and the maximum number of connections is reached. If you want to customize your messages further, Windows offers some user variables. Firstly, you can display in your message the total number of bytes received and bytes sent by the server. All you need to do is put the variable in your message and the value will be displayed to the user. Also, Windows supports variables for username, site name, and session ID. To better understand how to configure messages in FTP7, I will go into my FTP server and configure some. First, select FTP and then select the icon FTP Messages to open the Messages screen. Firstly, there is a number of options you can tick or untick. The first option suppresses the default banner so it does not appear. For security reasons, you may want to tick this option so that when a user connects to your FTP server, it will not display any information like your company name that a hacker may be able to use. The options support user variables in messages. You will need to tick if you use any user variables in your messages. If you do not tick this tick box, the user variables will not be substituted by their values. If the last message option is ticked, more detailed information and error messages will be displayed to the client when connected. If this option is not ticked, a lot of error messages will not be displayed to the end user. Next, you can enter in the text for your 4 messages. The banner will be displayed when the client first connects and before the login request. Notice I have added the user variable site name. The welcome message will be displayed after the user logs in. I have added session ID and user ID variables to this message. Next, the exit message. The bytes displayed here are the total bytes for that server. They are not related to the bytes received or sent during the user's session. Lastly, you have the maximum number of connections message, which is displayed when a user connects to the FTP server and the maximum number of connections for that server is reached. At a minimum, you should put authorized access in the banner to protect you legally. The rest of the messages are up to you if you want to use them. When using FTP, you will want to set the security of your FTP server to control who has access to your FTP server. If you want to allow anyone to use your FTP server, you will need to enable anonymous access. This allows any user to access your FTP server using the anonymous login. If you do not allow anonymous access, users will require a user account either on your local FTP server or a user account in Active Directory. Depending on the FTP client connecting to your FTP server, you may also need to enable basic authentication. Basic authentication supports more FTP clients, however, does mean that your usernames and passwords will be transmitted over the network in clear text. This is considered a security risk, but may be necessary to allow your clients to connect to your FTP site. To set up authentication, open your FTP site and select the FTP authentication icon. From the authentication screen, you will see that you have 2 options for authentication: anonymous authentication and basic authentication. To enable either, right-click the option and select Enable. Remember that basic authentication will allow usernames and passwords to be sent in clear text over your network. When anonymous users connect to your FTP site, they do so using a nominated Windows account. To change this account, right-click on Anonymous Authentication and select Edit. By default, Windows will use the local account IUSR. If this is not suitable, you can change the account. Lastly, there is an option in the action pane Custom Providers. If you want your FTP site to authenticate via ISS Manager Authentication, you can tick the tick box ISS Manager Auth. Otherwise, if you use Microsoft ASP.NET Authentication, you will need to tick the tick box ASP.NET Auth. Once you set up how people will be authenticated by your FTP server, you will need to set up some rules on what users can access. This can be done by setting up allow and deny rules. These rules are processed from the top down until an allow rule is found. Keep in mind that when you set up these rules, the deny rules are processed first. If you deny a group of users and then add an allow user for a user in that group, that user will be denied access because of the deny rule. These rules can be applied anywhere on your FTP site, all the way down to the folder level of your FTP site. Let's have a look how to add authorization rules to your FTP site. To add authorization rules to an FTP site, first of all, expand down to that FTP site. Select the icon FTP Authorization Rules and open it. This screen will show you all the rules which are currently active for that site. If you want to add an allow rule or a deny rule, you can do it from the Actions pane. So far, all users can access this FTP site. To show you how rules can be defined anywhere in a site, I will restrict access to the software folder to IT users only. To do this, expand down to the folder you want to put authorization rules on and select the FTP Authorization Rules icon. From here, you can see it has inherited the rules from its parent. First of all, I want to add an allow rule for the IT users. Once I have added the IT users to the software folder, I need to also tick the option Read and Write Access to give them full access to the software folder. Next, I want to remove the All Users Access rule and replace it with a deny rule. In the deny rule, I will deny all users access to the software folder for both read and write. What I have done is a very common mistake when learning how to use authorization rules. Remember that deny rules are processed first. Any member of the IT users group is also a member of the All Users group. When an IT user connects to the software folder, they will be denied access to the software folder by the first rule. The second rule will not even be processed. To fix this, I need to remove the deny rule I just created. When an IT user tries to access the software folder, the first rule will allow them access to the folder. When a user not in the IT user group tries to connect to the folder, Windows will go through the rule list from top to bottom. Since Windows cannot find an allow rule for the general user, the user will be denied access to the software folder. Microsoft recommend using denies only when necessary, and in most cases, you can achieve the same effect by not giving the user access. Only use deny rules if you have no other choice, and save yourself some tricky authorization troubleshooting. If you wish to secure your FTP site even more, with FTP7, you can allow or deny an FTP session based on the incoming connection. This can be done either on the IP address or the DNS name. If you enable DNS restrictions, it does require the FTP server to perform a reverse DNS lookup. This can impact performance on your FTP server. Let's have a look how to implement domain names and IP restrictions. To set up IP address or domain restrictions, expand down to your FTP site and select the icon FTP IPv4 address and domain restrictions. From here, you can either add allow entries or deny entries. I want to make this FTP server an external only FTP server, so I will deny all IP addresses from the internal network. I can either enter a single IP address or a range of IP addresses. Since I want all the internal network to have access, I will enter in a range of IP addresses. Now anyone from the internal network will be denied access to the FTP site. You can also set restrictions down to the folder level. If I expand down to the software folder, I have the FTP IPv4 address and domain restrictions icon. You will notice the deny entry I added to the root of the FTP site has been inherited by this folder. Notice also, in the Action panel there is an Edit Feature Settings. If I select this option, I can select the default action for IP addresses not in this list. This can be set to either allow the connection or deny the connection. If I select the option Enable Domain Name Restrictions, I can deny or allow the connection based on the DNS name of that connection. This does require a reverse DNS lookup to work correctly. Windows will also give me a dialog box indicating that a reverse DNS lookup can affect server performance. Now if I add another deny entry, you will notice I can enter a domain name instead of just an IP address. This configuration will deny anyone in the list and allow anyone not on the list. If you want to allow only certain IP addresses, change the feature setting to automatically deny and then add the entries you want to have access. If you have data on another server, you can use virtual directories and FTP to present the data to the user. Using virtual directories, you can organize your data in any hierarchy you like. Doing this means that the user will not even be aware that the data is on another server. As far as the end user is concerned, the data looks like it is on the FTP server. When the FTP server presents the data to the user, it can use either the user credentials to access the data on the other server. This is called pass-through authentication, or you can specify credentials. Let's have a look at virtual directories in action. To create a new virtual directory, Right-click on your FTP site and select Add Virtual Directory. In the Alias section, enter the name of the folder you would like to appear to the end user. This can be anything. In this case, I will call it Software. The physical path is the location of the data. In this case, it is a share called Downloads on App Server 4. The user will, however, not see this directory as downloads, but instead see it as software and not be aware that it is on another server. If I press the button Test Settings, you will notice that authentication has been set to pass-through by default. Authorization cannot be verified because this is determined by the user account used to connect to the FTP server. This means that the username used to connect to the FTP server also needs to have access to the share. If I press the Connect As button, I can specify the user that will be used to connect to this share. Since this is a test environment, I will use the administrator account. In your environment, you should follow the Microsoft principle of least privilege and use a username and password that has only the required access. If I press the Test Settings button, you will notice that the authentication and authorization options are now both green. Since I specified an account, Windows is able to check my access. Here you will notice the new software directory is under the FTP server. When the user connects to my FTP server, they will see a folder called Software with the contents of downloads from App Server 4. You will find that once you start using virtual directories, they will give you a lot of power to present your data in any way that you want to the end user. User isolation allows you to provide each user with their own home directory when they connect up to FTP. For example, if the local user John was to connect up to the FTP server, his root directory would be the user folder John. If the user Jane connects up to FTP, her root directory would be her folder Jane. If you enable it, you can completely isolate the user when they connect. This means user Jane and user John cannot change to any other directory outside their home directory. If you do not enable isolation, user John and user Jane can navigate to the parent directory or any other folder on the FTP server. For example, the download folder on this FTP site. Isolating users can provide you with a way to limit the user's access to only their directory. To set up user isolation, you will need to create a default users folder and the appropriate user directories. Depending on which username is given, will determine where FTP will look for this folder. This table shows the default locations used by FTP server depending on which type of user connects. When a user connects up to the FTP server, Windows will look for the home folder. If Windows cannot find a home folder, the user will be placed in the root of the FTP site. Keep this in mind when setting up your FTP site. You still need to set up proper security on your files and folders, even if you do enable user isolation. Let's have a look how to configure user isolation. First of all, expand down to your website, select the icon FTP User Isolation to open the FTP User Isolation window. By default, all users will be directed to the root of the FTP site. If you change the setting to Username Directory, any user that connects up to the FTP server will be directed to the user folder if one exists. Notice that none of the isolation settings are set, so the user will be free to change to any directory on the FTP server if they have permission to it. If you enable isolation, the first option isolates the user but also disables any virtual directories if you have any. The second option does the same as the first but allows the user to access global virtual directories if they have permission. The last option allows FTP to get its settings from Active Directory. In order to get this to work, you need to set up a username and password that the FTP server will use to retrieve information from Active Directory about the user. With FTP 7 in Windows Server 2008, Microsoft have added the option for bindings to make FTP in ISS easy to administer. Bindings allow you to create different services for the same files. Consider this example. A developer is creating a new web page using web development software. The developer then uploads the website to the web server using FTP. Once the files have been uploaded, the developer will want to test a newly uploaded website using a web browser. This requires HTTP access to the same files but using the HTTP protocol rather than the FTP protocol. Previously, this kind of configuration required the ISS administrator to create a separate website and a separate FTP site for the same data. With FTP 7, you can now combine FTP and HTTP access in the same site. If you want to think of it another way, you are simply enabling FTP access to an existing website. To add FTP access to the default website, select the default website and then select the option Bindings from the right-hand action pane. You can see that this site already is bound to HTTP. To add a new FTP binding, press the Add button and then select the type as FTP. Select the IP address if you wish and then enter a hostname. If you wish, you can also change the port number. The bindings will now be added to the default website, making the default website accessible by both FTP and HTTP. In order to see the new FTP options, select View and then select the option Refresh. You can now see the default website can be configured like an FTP site. Being able to bind services together like this saves you creating multiple sites for the same group of files. If you want to fine-tune your FTP settings, you can set some of the advanced settings. These are available by selecting Advanced in the action pane. These settings let you fine-tune the maximum number of connections as well as channel timeouts. If you do not want your FTP server to start automatically when Windows starts, you can change the default startup behavior here. Most of the settings in here you will never need to change. The default options will work fine. With Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista, you will notice a trend by Microsoft using more text files for configuration, and a lot of these text files being based on the XML format. IIS has a configuration file in XML format called applicationhost.config. This is located in your Windows directory under system32/inetsrv/config. You can see in the configuration file the config for the FTP server I just created. When configuring IIS or any other application in Windows Server 2008, you should use the admin tool provided with that application. Windows, however, also gives you the option for editing the XML file in a text editor. I would not recommend editing the XML file unless you have a really good reason to, but having the config in an XML file does make it easy to move from one server to another. Once you have your FTP server up and running, you may want to monitor the users that are connected to it. To do this, select the option FTP Current Sessions under your site. This screen will show all the currently connected users to your website, as well as details like the number of bytes transferred and sent, session IDs, and usernames. From this screen, you can also disconnect users if you need to. Probably the most widely used command in FTP is the client asking for a directory listing. It is not uncommon for FTP clients to ask for a directory listing every time the user changes directories. To see how FTP handles these requests, select the option FTP Directory Browsing from inside your FTP site. The first option determines the way the directory listing will be displayed to the user. By default, the directory listing will be displayed in MS-DOS style format. However, you can change this to Unix style format. The next option relates to what information is displayed in the directory listing. If you have virtual directories, you need to make sure that virtual directories is ticked. Otherwise, they will not display when the client displays the directory listing. The next option will show available bytes remaining on the hard disk of the FTP server to the FTP user. If quotas are enabled, bytes shown here are shown as the amount of bytes left to that user. Lastly, you can select the option 4-digit years, which will display all years with 4 digits rather than 2. FTP7 can keep a log file of all the activity that has happened on your FTP server. By default, this log file is stored on your system drive under inetpub/logs/log files. The information stored in these files can be customized to change the information that is recorded. You can also set up rollover details like when new logs are created and how big the log files can become. Let's have a look at log files in action. First, select the FTP site and then select the icon FTP logging to open the FTP logging screen. The first option allows you to set one log file per site or one log file for the whole server. This option really depends on your needs. The next option, select W3C fields, lets you decide which fields you want to include in the log files. By default, Microsoft have selected a lot of useful fields to include in the log file, but if you need to change these details, just tick and untick the boxes that you need. Next, you can change the directory the log files are stored in if you need to. You can also change the encoding of the log files. The log file rollover is probably the most important part. If the scheduled setting is set in the log file will be rolled over either daily, weekly, or monthly. Otherwise, you can specify when the log files will be rolled over or when they reach a certain size. Lastly, you can select the option Do not create new log files. If you have web servers in different time zones, you may want to seriously consider ticking the box Use local time for file naming and rollover. When this option is ticked, the file name of the log file will include details of the local server time and date when the log file was created. Lastly, if you want to view the log files, there is an option on the far right, View Logs. Selecting this option will open the directory where the log files are stored. From here, you can open the log files with Notepad or a log analyzing software. By default, all communication in FTP is sent in clear text. This is a security risk, especially if the FTP server is available over the internet. Windows Server 2008 with FTP 7 supports SSL over FTP to provide secure communication, otherwise known as FTPS. It does this with 40-bit key encryption, with the option of using 128-bit key encryption at the expense of processing power. SSL provides security for your FTP communication if your client supports it, and if you have a certificate for FTP to use. Let's have a look how to configure it. From the ISS admin tool, expand onto your FTP site and select the icon FTP SSL Settings. Firstly, select the certificate you want to use with SSL. By default, FTP will use SSL if it is supported by the client. Otherwise, FTP will use clear text. You can change this to required SSL connections, but this may prevent some clients from being able to connect to your FTP site. The Custom option allows you to fine-tune when SSL will be used. When you select Custom and then press the Advanced button, you can decide if to use encryption on the control channel or the data channel, or both. Selecting Require will encrypt all of the control channel, including usernames and passwords. But if you're only worried about an attacker stealing a username and password, and not worried about them capturing your data, select Require Only for Credentials option. This option will not encrypt the username and password and other control channel data. The data channel you can again allow or set to required encryption, but also has the Deny option. The Deny option will not encrypt any data transferred. If your data is not sensitive, then this is a good option to select to save you some CPU time. The last option on the FTP SSL screen allows you to switch on 128-bit encryption. Selecting this does put more load on the CPU, but if your server can handle it, or if you switch off encryption on the data channel, it is a good option to switch on. Once you have the FTP server up and running, you may need to configure some firewall settings on your network. FTP runs on two well-known ports, port 21 for the control port and port 20 for the data port. To make things even more complicated, when FTP is sending data to the clients, like a directory listing or a file, it will open another data port to send data to the client. In Windows Server 2008, this port is selected from the default dynamic port range, which is between 49,152 and 65,535. This is a different port range than used in previous operating systems like Windows Server 2003. Keep this in mind if you upgrade from Windows Server 2003 to Windows Server 2008. If you configure your network firewall for Windows Server 2003, it may no longer work correctly after the upgrade to Windows Server 2008. Since FTP uses so many ports, any firewalls between your user and the server may cause problems. The most common firewall-related problem is when the user can connect OK, but cannot receive files or directory listings. To understand this problem, you first need to understand how FTP works. First off, FTP has active mode. In active mode, the client first opens a connection to your server over port 21. Commands are issued over this connection. When a command is received to send data, either a directory listing or a file transfer, the FTP server makes a connection back to the client's PC to a dynamic port from port 20. This is where the first problem comes into place. If you are running a firewall on your client's computer, since the connection was not open from the client's firewall blocks the data connection. This is a limitation of active mode. To try and solve this problem, FTP developers came up with passive mode. Passive mode starts the same way as active mode. The client connects to the server over port 21. The server responds back with a port for the client to connect back with. The client connects to the server over this port. Since the server is not initiating the connection to the client's firewall will not block the connection. Most FTP clients support passive mode, so this helps overcome this problem. If your end users are having problems transferring files or receiving directories, get them to enable passive mode in their FTP client. This may fix the problem. The next problem occurs when there is a firewall between the client and the server. In order to get passive mode to work correctly, the firewall between the client's computer and the server needs to allow all possible ports the FTP server may use. By default, this is all the Windows dynamic port range, or 1638 ports. This is not good security to allow this many ports through your firewall. To fix this problem, you need to reduce the number of ports the FTP server uses. Firstly, open ISS Manager and select FTP from the left-hand pane. This will change settings for the whole FTP server, not just the one FTP site. Select the icon FTP Firewall Support. You will notice the default data channel port range is 0-0. This means Windows will use the default port range. You can enter in your own port range here. The size of the range will depend on your own needs. A busy server will need a lot of ports. A less busy one, you may be able to get by with just a few. If you are planning on using SSL over FTP, you may need to enter in the IP address of your firewall. This allows the FTP server to determine that the SSL packets came from your firewall. Otherwise, the FTP server may drop the packets. Hit Apply to set the new FTP settings. The last message reminds you that you also need to make changes to your local Windows Server 2008 firewall. Having a firewall on each device is great security, but unfortunately does provide a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. When troubleshooting FTP, make sure that you have all your firewall settings correct. When Windows Server 2008 was released, FTP 7 was still in development. To provide an FTP solution, Microsoft bundled FTP 6 with Windows Server 2008. I would recommend using FTP 7 over FTP 6 as FTP 7 is integrated with ISS 7. This means you can use the ISS 7 admin tool to configure it. If you do decide to install FTP 6, it does require ISS 6 compatibility components like the ISS 6 admin tool. Let's have a look how to install FTP 6 on Windows Server 2008. In order to use FTP 6 on Windows Server 2008, you need to install it through the Server Manager found under Administrative Tools in the Start menu. Select Roles and then select the option Add Roles. From the list, go down and select Web Server and then add the required prerequisites if prompted. To add FTP 6, go to the bottom to FTP Publishing. If I select FTP Management Console, you will notice that the ISS 6 admin tool needs to be installed as well. The management tools also require ISS 6 Metabase compatibility. If I select the FTP Server option, you will notice the description does not mention which version of FTP it is installing, but it is 6. Keep in mind that you should not install version 6 and version 7 of FTP on the same server. If you want to install FTP 6 on a server that has FTP 7, make sure that you uninstall FTP 7 before you install FTP 6. Once FTP 6 is installed, you can configure it using the ISS 6 admin tool. Notice now that in the Start menu, you have two admin tools for ISS. To create a new FTP site, right-click FTP site and select New FTP site. Also notice that if you had a configuration file for the FTP site, you can import it here. This will start the FTP site creation wizard. Firstly, enter a description for your new FTP site. Next, you can set the IP address and port the FTP server will use. On this screen, you can enable isolation settings. By default, any user that connects up to the FTP server can access any file or folder that they have permission to. If you select the option Isolate Users, the user's home directory will be presented to the user as the root directory of the FTP server. If you select this option, the user will not be able to access any other directories on the FTP server. The last option isolates users according to Active Directory. This allows you to configure the FTP settings in Active Directory, which has its advantages. However, it does mean that any users connected to your FTP server need to have a username in Active Directory. On the next screen, you can select a home directory for your FTP server. In my case, I will create a folder called General FTP under the iNet pub directory. This will become the root directory of my FTP server. Next, you can set the permissions of the users that will access the FTP server. The permissions set here will take precedent over the permissions of the files and folders in Windows. Once you are done setting up your new FTP server, you can see which FTP servers are currently running in the admin tool. Before users can access my new FTP server, I will need to start it. I can do this by using the Start button at the top of the admin tool. Once you have set up your FTP site, you may want to configure it. To configure the FTP site, right-click the site and select Properties. This will bring up the Properties windows for the FTP site. On the FTP site tab, you can set a description for your FTP site, the IP address the FTP site will use, and the port. If you change the IP address or the port, you will need to restart the service before it will take effect. You can also set connection limits if your FTP site is getting a lot of traffic and you want to manage your bandwidth better. You can enable logging here if you want to troubleshoot or keep a record of FTP activities. The logging options are much the same as FTP version 7, so I won't worry about going through them. The Current Session button shows any active sessions on your FTP server. From here, you can monitor or disconnect sessions if you wish. On the Security Accounts tab, you can specify the account that will be used for anonymous access. On the Messages tab, you can enter the text that will be displayed to the user. The banner text is displayed before the user logs into the FTP site. The welcome screen is displayed after the user logs in. It is important that on either the message or the banner screen, you put an authorized user or restricted access only message. If you leave this message out and put a message instead, like something like, "Welcome to my FTP server," you will not be able to prosecute a would-be hacker in court if they cause damage to your site. You can also enter in a message when the user leaves the site and another message if maximum connections is exceeded. The Home Directory tab allows you to set where the directory for the root of the FTP server is located. Notice you can also have the root directory located on another server if you wish. Having the home directory on another server may seem a little strange, but this is common practice when you have multiple FTP servers serving the same data. This configuration provides multiple FTP servers for redundancy, but also means that you only need to have one copy of the data. The Directory Security tab defines which IP addresses or computers can access your FTP server. Notice that the list is either grant access or deny access. If you select deny access, then everybody can access your FTP server unless there is an entry for them in the list. If you select grant access, then no one can access the FTP server unless you add an entry for them in your list. That's it for FTP 6. You will notice that there are a lot of options and features in FTP 6 that are available in FTP 7. The main differences between the two is the way administration is performed. For the exam, you will need to know both, but as time goes on, expect Microsoft to ask more and more questions about FTP 7 and less about FTP 6.